For more than 100 years, one of the most famous ships in the history of polar exploration lay at the bottom of the Weddell Sea in Antarctica at 3,000 meters depth in one of the most remote, hostile, and inaccessible areas on the planet. Experts agreed that finding it was practically impossible. The conditions of the Weddell Sea, with its constantly moving ice, its extreme temperatures, and its location at the far south of the world, made any search expedition a logistical and technological challenge of enormous proportions. But in 2022, underwater robots descended to those frozen waters and found the Endurance. The ship of explorer Ernest Shackleton, so well preserved that one of the expedition directors described the scene as if the ship had sunk yesterday, and what the three-dimensional images composed of 25,000 high-resolution photographs revealed is a story that has been waiting more than a century to be told with this clarity. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Let us begin. To understand why the discovery of the Endurance moved the entire world, and why specialists in maritime exploration consider it one of the most extraordinary discoveries of recent decades, one must first know the story of the man who commanded it, and of the expedition that ended with that ship at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. Ernest Shackleton was in 1914 one of the most recognized and respected polar explorers in the world. An Irishman of exceptional character who had participated in previous expeditions to Antarctica and who had demonstrated a leadership capacity and a physical and psychological resistance that few men of his era could match. His objective with the Endurance expedition was to complete the first overland crossing of Antarctica, crossing the continent from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, passing through the South Pole, a distance of approximately 2,900 kilometers through the most inhospitable territory on the planet. The Endurance departed from South Georgia Island in December 1914, entering the waters of the Weddell Sea bound for the Antarctic coast. But nature had other plans. Within a few weeks of navigation, the ship became trapped in the sea ice of the Weddell Sea, ice that in that area of the South Atlantic moves driven by currents and winds in patterns that are practically impossible to predict with precision. The Endurance was immobilized, prisoner of a mass of ice that had no intention of releasing it. Shackleton and his 27 men found themselves in a situation without precedent in the history of polar exploration, trapped in a motionless ship, adrift on ice, in one of the most extreme environments on Earth, with no possibility of advancing or retreating and without communication with the outside world. For months, the crew lived aboard the Endurance while ice slowly dragged them adrift. Shackleton maintained the morale of his men with a skill that historians continue to study as an extraordinary example of leadership in extreme conditions. He established routines, organized activities, fostered humor and camaraderie, and constantly conveyed a confidence in the group's survival that proved prophetic, though at that moment it must have been difficult to sustain even for him. The expedition's photographer, Frank Hurley, documented all that period with a dedication and artistic quality that produced some of the most iconic photographs in the history of polar exploration, images of the Endurance trapped in the ice that have become symbols of human audacity and resistance in the face of the most adverse nature. But the ice kept tightening, and the cumulative pressure on the Endurance's wooden hull eventually reached a point that no vessel could withstand. The ship began to give way, its timbers creaking and deforming under the colossal pressure of the ice, and Shackleton made the decision to order the abandonment of the vessel before it completely sank. The crew transferred to the lifeboats everything they could carry: provisions, survival equipment, Hurley's journals and photographs, and prepared to watch their home of the past months sink irremediably. On November 21, 1915, the Endurance disappeared beneath the waters of the Weddell Sea, and with it the possibility of completing the expedition that had been its reason for being. What happened after the sinking of the Endurance is the part of Shackleton's story that has most captured the imagination of the public and historians during the following century. Without a ship on the moving ice of the Weddell Sea, with temperatures dropping to dozens of degrees below zero and with no possibility of being rescued if they did not act themselves, Shackleton led his 27 men in a survival odyssey that lasted months and included journeys in lifeboats through the most stormy seas on the planet, exhausting walks over ice and land in extreme conditions, and finally the rescue of all members of the expedition without the loss of a single life. The 27 men who had departed with Shackleton returned home. It is an achievement that in the context of the conditions they faced seems almost miraculous, and which cemented Shackleton's reputation as one of the most extraordinary leaders that the history of human exploration has produced. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. For 107 years, the Endurance remained where the Weddell Sea had received it in November 1915 at 3,000 meters depth, at a point on the seabed that no one knew exactly where it was. The approximate coordinates of the sinking were known thanks to the expedition's navigation records, but the Weddell Sea is enormous. The conditions for any underwater search in that area are extraordinarily difficult, and for decades the technology needed to explore those depths with sufficient precision simply did not exist. The Endurance became the great unfound shipwreck of modern history, a ship whose story was perfectly known but whose exact location at the bottom of the ocean remained as one of the last great mysteries of maritime exploration. It was the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust, a non-governmental organization based in London dedicated to preserving the maritime history of the Falkland Islands and their surrounding waters, that financed and organized the expedition that finally resolved that mystery in 2022. The expedition used cutting-edge underwater technology developed in collaboration between the company Deep Ocean Search, the specialized underwater vision company Voyis Imaging, and McGill University in Canada. The underwater robots deployed in the search were capable of mapping the seabed with unprecedented precision and detail, and when they finally located the remains of the Endurance, they began the meticulous process of photographing it from all possible angles to create the three-dimensional scan that would become the most lasting legacy of the expedition. The result of that documentation work was a digital scan composed of 25,000 high-resolution images that were processed and joined to create a complete digital replica of the ship. For the first time in more than 100 years, it was possible to see the Endurance in its entirety, from bow to stern of its 44 meters in length, as if the murky and dark water surrounding it had been completely drained. The scan revealed a state of conservation that surprised even the most optimistic specialists. The frozen waters of the Weddell Sea, with their temperature near freezing point and their particular chemical composition, had preserved the wood of the Endurance's hull with extraordinary fidelity. The basic structure of the ship is practically intact, and although the ice that crushed it before sinking knocked down the masts and damaged parts of the deck, the general image the scan offers is that of a ship that seems to have arrived at the bottom of the sea relatively recently, not more than a century ago. The details that the scientific team discovered when meticulously examining the scan are what make this finding something that transcends simple underwater exploration and connects the present with a specific and deeply emotional human story. On the deck of the Endurance, visible in the scan with a clarity that makes it almost difficult to believe they have been at the bottom of the sea for more than 100 years, are the plates the crew used for their daily meals, scattered on the wood as if they had been left there that very morning. There is a boot that researchers believe may have belonged to Frank Wild, the second in command of the expedition and the man closest to Shackleton throughout the entire Odyssey, a personal object that belonged to a real human being and that lies at the bottom of the Weddell Sea exactly where it fell or was left in the chaotic moments of abandoning the ship. But the object that most impacted the researchers, the one that John Shears, director of the 2022 expedition, described as incredible, is the flare gun. In the journals that members of the original expedition kept throughout their Odyssey, there is an entry that describes the moment when Frank Hurley, the photographer, took that flare gun and fired it into the air as the Endurance sank, an improvised farewell gesture, a tribute to the ship that had been their home for months and was now disappearing forever beneath the ice. And the journal records that Hurley left that flare gun on the ship's deck after firing it. 107 years later, the underwater robots of the 2022 expedition photographed that same gun, still on the deck of the Endurance, exactly where Hurley left it the day the ship sank. It is the type of connection between past and present that makes underwater archaeology something more than science, that converts it into an active recovery of human memory in its most tangible and most moving form. Nico Vincent of the company Deep Ocean Search and co-director of the expedition described the remains of the ship as absolutely fabulous, preserved almost intact, as if it had sunk yesterday. Vincent also noted that the three-dimensional scan is not only a historical document, but also an active scientific tool that researchers will be able to use for years to study the marine life that has colonized the wreck's remains, to analyze the seabed geology in that area of the Weddell Sea, and to discover new artifacts in the scan that perhaps were not identified during the initial analysis. The scan belongs to the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust and will be available for scientific research and education, which means that its value will multiply over time as new generations of researchers study it with tools and perspectives that do not yet exist today. Shackleton's descendants have made it clear that the Endurance will never be raised from the bottom of the sea, and that decision is absolutely correct from all points of view, both the scientific and the ethical and historical. The ship is where it should be, in the place where history left it in November 1915, surrounded by the cold waters that have preserved it so well for more than a century. Its location in one of the most remote and least accessible corners of the planet protects it from human disturbance better than any regulation or heritage protection law could do. And the three-dimensional scan means that the world can know the Endurance with a level of detail that no physical visit could offer, because the digital replica shows the ship complete, illuminated, from all angles without the limitations imposed by the darkness and pressure of 3,000 meters of water. The story of the Endurance, the story of Shackleton and his men, the story of Frank Hurley's flare gun that waited 107 years at the bottom of the Weddell Sea, can now be told with a completeness and vividness that had not been possible until the underwater robots descended to find it. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.